They told him to let the ashes settle and walk away. But he couldn't. An old broke veteran returned to his father's burned-down farm in a freezing North Dakota winter, hoping only to say goodbye. But when his loyal German shepherd kept clawing at an old concrete slab beside the ruined barn, they uncovered a hidden safe buried beneath the ice and stone. Inside were a journal, a USB drive, and a secret about a powerful agrochemical company that had been poisoning the land and buying up farms for years. What they found wouldn't just clear his father's name, it would ignite a war that could bring an entire corporation to its knees. Before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city, state, or country in the comments below. It's always incredible to see how far these stories travel. Winter pressed its weight upon the empty fields, snow stretching endlessly over the Fargo countryside like a silent shroud of white. Henry Walker stood at the edge of what once was home his father's farmhouse. Now only skeletal beams jutted from the ground, like the blackened ribs of a fallen beast. The cold gnawed through his coat, a thick but worn military jacket that bore the faded insignia of a time when he still had purpose, still had orders to follow. At 70 years old, Henry's body was lean and hardened from decades in the army, but his hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from memories that crept in like frost beneath a door. His hair, a mix of steel gray and white, peeked from under his wool hat, and his jaw, chiseled once by discipline, sagged slightly under the weight of grief. 6 months ago, the army had signed his retirement papers. 2 months ago, the fire took everything else. He missed his father's voice more than he missed the warmth the fire had stolen. Thomas Walker had been a quiet, rugged man, tall with shoulders like barn beams, and eyes that could read every inch of the land he cared for. To Henry, his father was the last piece of home left in the world. And now he was gone in what the sheriff called a tragic electrical accident. Henry crouched, scooping a handful of snow mixed with ash. It stained his glove gray. He wiped it on his pants and stared blankly at the charred ruins. "Was this your end, Dad?" "Just flames and silence." His voice was hoarse, as though the smoke from the fire still lingered in his throat. The crunch of snow pulled him back. Sheriff Collins, a broad-shouldered man in his early 50s with a thick brown mustache, hiding a jawline that had softened over time, stepped toward him with feigned sympathy. His uniform was neat boots polished, but his eyes flicked nervously around the scene, avoiding direct contact. Collins always acted overly professional, yet something about him seemed constantly unsettled, like a man who feared someone might notice the dirt under his fingernails. Henry the sheriff drawled, voice tired or pretending to be, "I know this ain't easy. Your father was a good man, but the investigation found faulty wiring. These old barns, you know how they are." Henry's stare hardened. "My father checked every wire twice a year. There's nothing faulty about him." Collins forced a congenial shrug, but his lips tightened like a man desperate to end a conversation. "Sometimes accidents just happen, son." He patted Henry's shoulder, too quick, too rehearsed, and turned back toward his cruiser, leaving a swirl of distrust in the cold air. Only a day later, another unwanted visitor arrived. Arthur Davis, a slim man in a charcoal suit that fit so perfectly it likely cost more than Henry's truck. Davis had slick dark hair combed back without a strand out of place and a smile too thin to be genuine. Everything about him screamed polished superiority. "I'm with the insurance firm," he stated immediately, offering no condolence, only paperwork. "Your father's policy was sizable, enough to help you rebuild assuming everything checks out." His gaze sharpened, calculating. Of course, investigators always ask inconvenient questions when the beneficiary has a military background. Henry stiffened. "You think I burned my father alive?" Davis smirked, stepping back as if Henry were the fire itself. "Just procedure," he lied too smoothly. Then he left the exhaust from his luxury sedan swirling across the devastated land, like a snake's tail dragging secrets behind it. After that day, Fargo didn't look at Henry the same. Whispers in grocery aisles, cautious glances at gas stations. People who once waved now turned their backs. It felt like war again, only this time the enemy was doubt, and it marched behind every familiar face. But Henry wasn't alone. Not entirely. One evening, as he surveyed the silent ruins, he spotted movement near the distant fence line. A German shepherd, large gray-black fur dusted with snow, stood watch. Its golden-brown eyes were sharp, intelligent, but full of caution. The dog knew that was Ranger, his father's loyal companion. He had vanished months before the fire, and Thomas had dismissed it as a dog's adventure. Now Ranger was back, but not the same. His ribs pressed faintly against his fur hard months on his own. His tail hung low, not in submission, but in wary distance. Henry slowly extended a hand. "Hey, boy. I remember you." Ranger's ears twitched, but he stepped back. Trust wasn't easy, not after everything. Henry left food and water near the foundation each night. Come morning, both bowls were empty. A silent pact formed in the frost. Henry talked to Ranger for hours, sometimes not expecting answers, just needing ears that would listen. He spoke of dusty battlefields where the sand stung like needles of long nights staring into the dark, waiting for an enemy that might never come of coming home to a place where he now felt like the outsider. And Ranger stayed near, listening, blinking slowly, as though piecing Henry's sorrow into something it could understand. One night Henry finally knelt in the snow, shoulders shaking. No sound, no tears, just a man trying not to collapse under the weight in his chest. His breath trembled like loose paper in the wind. Soft footsteps crunched closer. Ranger approached, nose, lowered eyes, gentle, but filled with their own haunted past. He nudged Henry's cold hand with his snout, a touch small enough to be overlooked, but powerful enough to bind two lonely survivors together. Henry's fingers curled into Ranger's fur. Warmth, solidarity, a promise. From that moment, Ranger followed Henry everywhere, never inside, always just within reach. But loyalty wasn't the only thing Ranger brought. He brought purpose. It began with restless pacing. Ranger circled, Henry nudged his coat, then trotted a few yards away before turning back with a sharp bark. Henry frowned, rising slowly. "What is it, boy?" Ranger led him past the broken barn through a patch of brittle weeds to an old slab of concrete, mostly buried beneath the snow. It was part of a cattle shed dismantled decades ago. The dog sniffed with frantic urgency, then began clawing at the frozen surface paws, scraping stone with a sound that echoed fear into Henry's bones. Henry knelt and brushed snow aside. At first glance, the slab looked like any forgotten ruin. But there, a thin, straight seam, too clean to be natural, slicing through the concrete like a scar. His heart kicked hard. He fetched a crowbar and sledgehammer from the warehouse where he had been sleeping. Each strike against the seam sent vibrations rattling up his arms, every swing fueled by mounting dread and desperate hope. Ice cracked. Stone shifted. Sweat mixed with frost on his brow, breath puffing in harsh rhythms. Ranger watched muscles tense as if guarding the truth itself. Finally, with a jarring crack, a section of concrete broke loose. Henry pried it up, revealing the mouth of a small cavity carved into the frozen earth. Inside, untouched by fire, cold, or time, lay a fireproof safe, solid steel, heavy, silent. Ranger let out a low, triumphant rumble, tail wagging, with quiet certainty. Henry stared down into the darkness beneath the slab, breath lost in a swirl of winter air. The sheriff had wanted the case closed. The insurance man had smirked at suspicions. But his father, his careful, stubborn, brilliant father, had hidden something important enough to bury in steel and stone. Henry placed a hand on Ranger's head. The dog leaned into the touch. Whatever secret had taken his father's life, they were about to uncover it together. The cold hung thick inside the metal warehouse, the single bulb above Henry, casting long shadows that stretched like silent witnesses across the floor. Snow tapped lightly on the corrugated roof, the soft rhythm contrasting sharply with the pounding of Henry Walker's heart. The safe he and Ranger had unearthed waited before him, dust still clinging to its steel surface, as though trying to protect what lay inside. His hands, wrinkled, scarred, and steadied by decades of soldiering, hovered over the lock-picking tools he hadn't touched in years. Memories crept into his thoughts as he worked. Nights crouched in dark rooms overseas, the click of tumblers signaling survival or disaster. He inhaled, forcing focus. One click, another, then a heavy release. The safe door groaned open, revealing its secrets, a thick, worn leather journal and a small silver USB drive wrapped in cloth. Ranger, the 7- or 8-year-old German shepherd, with a wild dignity about him, lay curled at Henry's feet, his fur streaked with gray beneath the smoky black. The dog's eyes lifted to Henry's eyes that carried grief no animal should ever know. Henry lowered a hand, brushing his fingers against Ranger's head, as though grounding himself to the present. He picked up the journal first. Its leather was cracked rough beneath his fingertips, but familiar, just like his father's voice had been. Thomas Walker had always been precise with his penmanship, a habit ingrained from years of documenting harvest cycles and tractor repairs. The first pages were filled with entries about weather yields and the minor victories and aggravations of farm life. But gradually the tone shifted, notes became sharper edges tinged with unease. Thomas wrote about Greenstone Agrotech, a corporation that had swept into Fargo, promising modern agriculture's salvation. They brought EverYield, a fertilizer marketed as revolutionary, tripling crops with half the effort. Farmers who adopted it prospered quickly at first. Thomas, cautious and stubborn, had tested it only on a small strip of land. His results were too good. That frightened him. Soon he described the soil turning to powder where EverYield had been used. Nutrients drained, earth suffocating. Water samples showed contamination. Microorganisms needed to sustain life were dying beneath the surface. Thomas's careful fingers had written a warning. EverYield doesn't feed the land, it starves it. Henry's chest tightened as he continued reading. His father had recorded conversations with Greenstone representatives who came with smiles and pressure to expand EverYield's use. He wrote of meetings with a man named Gregory Cole, CEO of Greenstone. Cole had a polished smile, but his eyes, according to Thomas, were winter bright and cold, the kind that kills crops quietly beneath the snow. He threatened without threatening, spoke of progress while hinting that stubbornness could lead to losing everything. Then came the final entry, scribbled urgently, days before the fire. If something happens to me, this was not an accident. Trust Ranger. He knows where to lead you. Henry closed the journal slowly, chest burning with a mix of sorrow and rage. His father hadn't been paranoid. He had been silenced. He pocketed the USB and journal, deciding immediately where he had to go. The law office of Samuel Price sat at the edge of downtown Fargo, housed in a modest red brick building with wide frosted windows and a creaky wooden door. Inside smelled of old paper and coffee that had been reheated one too many times. Samuel, now in his late 60s, looked exactly like a man who'd spent decades wading through legal battles too big for his small office. His wiry frame, slightly hunched, carried a gentle strength. His short silver hair framed a lined face softened by kind brown eyes hidden behind round glasses. "Henry," Samuel breathed, standing slowly, his voice filled with genuine sorrow. "I'm so sorry about your father." Henry set the journal and USB on the desk. He didn't die in an accident. Samuel's eyebrows lifted not in disbelief, but in weary recognition. He knew something like this might come. The lawyer reached into a drawer, removing a sealed envelope stamped with wax. He asked me to give this to you only if he couldn't. Inside the envelope lay a list of accounts' coded notes, and another message written in Thomas's careful script. Don't trust Greenstone. Don't trust those who rush to close the case. Samuel leaned forward, his fingers tapping nervously. Henry Gregory Cole is dangerous. Greenstone owns influence from the courthouse to state offices. If you push this, they will push back harder. Henry met his eyes. I've survived wars. They can't scare me off my father's truth. Samuel nodded, though worry darkened his features. Then tread carefully, and don't do this alone. Henry returned to the warehouse that evening. Snow falling thicker now, muting the world to stillness. Ranger paced by the door, restless ears angled toward the dark outside as though sensing a threat lurking just beyond sight. Henry sat before his father's old computer, a relic with a dented casing and a hum that wavered like an elderly man breathing. He inserted the USB. The screen flickered, then demanded a password. A clue beneath, where the river remembers the sky. Henry closed his eyes. He was young again, standing on a ridge beside his father. Beneath them, the river mirrored the sky perfectly, so still, the clouds looked painted on water. His mother had called that place Heaven's Mirror. The year she passed was 1979. Henry typed Heaven's Mirror, 1979. The screen unlocked. There were folders, dozens labeled with meticulous categorization, soil samples, water analyses, surveillance notes, dates, locations. But the most damning were the internal Greenstone emails. Cold, concise language outlining a systematic plan. Poison the land, buy the land cheap, make farmers addicted to ever-yield. Henry found payment ledgers tied to shell accounts, and one name struck him hardest, James Collins, likely a relative of Sheriff Collins. They weren't just ignoring the truth, they were being paid to bury it. His pulse hammered brutally. He pressed palms to his eyes, overwhelmed not just by the evidence, but by the crushing loneliness of the moment. The world outside wanted him silent and small. A wet nose nudged his arm. Ranger sat beside him, tail sweeping the floor once in reassurance. Henry exhaled a huff of laughter despite the tightness in his throat. You're right, he murmured. Someone's got to eat even while we take down corporate villains. Ranger's ears perked as if he understood the joke and the battle ahead. Henry stared again at the glowing screen. He saw his father's handwriting in every dataset, every detail. This wasn't just evidence. It was Thomas Walker's final stand, a farmer fighting a war no one else could see. Henry's voice was barely a whisper, Dad. I'll finish what you started. And with Ranger pressed close, warmth radiating through the chill, Henry realized something else. He wasn't alone after all. Night stretched long and heavy over Fargo, the sky a sheet of iron-gray cloud swallowing the moon. Inside the warehouse, the small pool of light glowing from the computer screen felt like the last campfire in a wilderness of danger. Henry Walker sat stiffly in his chair, exhaustion deepening the lines on his aging face, while Ranger lay beside him, ears alert even in half-sleep, ever the silent sentinel. Knowing the truth was one thing. Fighting a monster like Greenstone was another. Henry had fought powerful men before on deserts, in forests, in places where names didn't matter. But now the battlefield was his own home soil, and his allies were nowhere in sight. He scrolled through the evidence again, charts, emails, and numbers that spelled out destruction. His father's work, his father's warning, his father's murder. Henry reached for the old flip phone he still carried, its surface scratched and dented like an aging soldier's armor. He dialed names he had once memorized out of Brotherhood men who had shared foxholes and fear with him. One by one, familiar voices answered. Some spoke with warmth, at first surprise, joy, a spark of shared past. But when Henry explained the fire, the USB greenstone, their voices hardened. Not against him, no, against the terror of losing everything again. Henry, I've got grandkids. I can't fight anymore, man. They'd bury me before sundown. Each refusal was gentle, yet drenched in regret. War had followed those men home like a shadow. Not one of them wanted to summon it again. Henry hung up after the last call, shoulders sinking, not in defeat, but in loneliness. Only one name remained. Tom Garcia. Tom had always been the kind of man who didn't need reasons to stand with you, just a phone call. He had been tall and barrel-chested even at 20, with copper-brown skin and black hair cropped close during the war. Years later, he was still solid, though bits of silver threaded his temples. A faint scar cut through his left eyebrow, a jagged memory of a grenade that nearly ended him. His voice, when he finally picked up, was deep and steady. Henry told him everything. The fire, the suspicion, the hidden safe, the files, the rot beneath greenstone. He expected a long silence. Instead, Tom simply said, "I'll be there tomorrow morning." No hesitation, no dramatic speech, just loyalty. Morning came with a biting wind. Ranger's head lifted long before the truck's engine could be heard. Moments later, a dark gray pickup rolled onto the property. Tom climbed out, shoulders still, broad eyes sharper than any blade. His coat was military-grade boots, clean, but scuffed across the toes, signs of a man who knew action more than rest. He clasped Henry's hand. The grip was firm, grounding. "You look like hell," he said with a smirk. Henry chuckled dryly. "Considering the week, I think I look fantastic." But Tom's expression sobered quickly as he reviewed the files. He stood silently, jaw clenched. "They killed your father because he was getting too close. And they're not finished." He rested a hand on Ranger's head. The dog sniffed him cautiously before accepting the gesture. Tom always had a way with creatures and chaos alike. "We've got evidence," Tom continued, "but we need someone who can weaponize data. Someone who knows how to fight in the digital mud." Henry's brow furrowed. "Anyone in mind?" Tom nodded once. "Lena Hayes." Lena Hayes lived 2 hours east in Moorhead, in a cluttered apartment above an abandoned print shop. The building smelled of dust and burnt coffee, its halls dim lit by flickering lights. Lena answered the door with a skeptical arch of her eyebrow. She was in her early 40s with untamed auburn hair tied in a messy knot and freckles scattered across fair skin that hadn't seen the sun enough lately. She wore an oversized hoodie and jeans frayed at the knees, fingers stained with ink and keyboard grime. When she first spoke, her tone was sharp, sarcastic armor against the world. "Well, look what the war dragged in a grandpa vigilante, and—" She paused, eyes shifting to Ranger, a very handsome accomplice. Ranger huffed, unimpressed. Henry couldn't help but grin. Lena's wit was a mask for pain. Once a respected investigative journalist, she had exposed Greenstone's early misconduct only to be discredited, harassed, and blacklisted from the industry. When no newsroom would hire her, she became a hacker for hire, fighting truth's war from the shadows. They explained everything. Her face went from amused to furious as she browsed the USB. "So I wasn't crazy," she muttered. "They really are poisoning the land and paying cops to keep quiet." Pain flickered through her eyes, vindication laced with bitterness. "Fine," she sighed. "I'll help. But we need more than spreadsheets. We need real people harmed by Everyield." Henry nodded. Someone already came to mind. The next morning, they drove through rolling fields buried under winter's weight until they reached a weary farmstead. Rust coated the grain silos like a spreading disease. The farmhouse was small, once white, but now charred by years of wind and hopelessness. George Miller stepped out cautiously when the truck approached. He was in his late 40s, but looked older, sunken cheeks, cracked lips, skin chapped red by cold and work. His hands, large and calloused, held a faded winter hat he twisted anxiously. "What do you want?" His voice held defeat, not hostility. Lena introduced Henry and Tom, and Henry presented Thomas's journal, soil reports, and emails. George's eyes, dull and wary, scanned each page as if reading the diagnosis of his dying land. "I've used Everyield for 4 years," George said hoarsely. "First-year harvest was the best since my daddy ran this place. Second was okay. Last year, nothing but dust." His voice cracked. "I thought it was my fault, that I killed my own farm." Ranger approached George gently, leaning against his leg. The man blinked rapidly, overcome by a kindness he hadn't felt in years. Henry placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "It's not your fault," Henry said. "Your land was attacked. So was mine. So was my father." George's hands balled into fists, not against himself anymore, but against the ones who played God with other people's roots. "Tell me what you need me to do." Tom stepped beside them, arms crossed. "We expose them, together." Lena folded her arms as well, but her smirk softened. "Guess we're a team now. An old soldier, a watchdog, a disgraced reporter, and a stubborn farmer. What could possibly go wrong?" Henry breathed a slow, steady breath. His allies were here. Real allies. And though their numbers were small, their hearts burned with purpose, hotter than any fire Greenstone could ignite. Ranger barked once, loud and sure, as if calling the battle to begin. Together, they would show Greenstone that the soil still had defenders and that the dead were not done fighting. The wind that night carried razors of cold through the air, slicing across the flatlands of North Dakota, as if even nature itself wished to warn anyone foolish enough to be outside. Yet Henry Walker, wrapped in dark winter gear, moved steadily across the frozen ground, with the quiet precision of a man who had once lived in the shadows of far more dangerous nights. His breath rose in ghostly wisps beneath the silver starlight. Ranger padded ahead, fur bristling nose, low paws, silent despite the snow. To Henry, the dog looked like a phantom wolf leading a soldier back into war. Behind him was Tom Garcia, taller and broader than Henry, his heavy boots barely making a sound. Tom's strong jaw was clenched tight, the scar over his brow catching the faint glow of the moon. Nights like these reminded him of operations, overseas missions, done quietly, with no guarantee of coming home. But here, the stakes felt somehow deeper. This wasn't defending a distant flag. This was defending roots, soil, family. Miles away on the edge of a dirt road sat a battered RV, its once white paint now an uneven coat of rust and faded stickers. Inside, Lena Hayes sat with her legs crossed on a chair too small for comfort, her face illuminated by the glow of multiple screens. Her hair, normally unruly, was tied back tight, determination sharpening her angular features. Fingers flew across the keyboard with the kind of grace earned by years of fighting digital battles. "Camera 1 down," she murmured into the headset. On the screen, security feeds flickered into static, one by one. Camera 2, sleeping. Camera 3, taking a nap. Tom smirked, pressing a finger to his earpiece. "Cute metaphors. Reminds me of bedtimes with my kids." Lena snorted. "Trust me, I'd rather put toddlers to sleep than security systems. At least toddlers don't call the cops." Henry didn't speak, he didn't need to. His pulse steadied as he followed Ranger to the chain-link fence surrounding Greenstone Agrotech's distribution center. The facility stretched out like a fortress of white metal warehouses, floodlights casting harsh cones across snow-blanketed ground. The chemical smell, acrid, artificial, already clung to the air. Henry lifted the wire slightly. Ranger darted under first, then Henry, then Tom. They kept low moving along blind spots Lena identified. Ranger halted suddenly, muscles coiled like springs, a low growl vibrating in his chest. Henry followed the dog's stare. A flashlight beam swept lazily across the yard not 10 steps ahead. A security guard trudged past a man in his mid-30s with a soft, round stomach and a too large uniform. His beard was patchy, and he looked more interested in finishing his coffee than guarding multi-million-dollar secrets. The beam drifted aside and the man continued his bored patrol. Ranger led on. Inside one particular warehouse, thick barrels towered above them like silent, toxic soldiers. A chemical tang thickened the air enough to sting Henry's throat. The barrels bore a chilling label, "Raw stock, do not mix." Tom whistled under his breath. If this stuff is pure ever yield, we're standing in a field of loaded guns. Henry collected a sample carefully into a sterile vial. Tom attached tiny devices, cameras shaped like screwheads, listening bugs disguised as wire connectors to various cables. The ex-security officer's movements were smooth, practiced, as though he'd spent years waiting for a cause worth his training. Then Ranger barked once sharp. The signal. Time to vanish. The three slipped back into the night like a gust of wind brushing past the walls. No alarm. No shouts. Their presence erased in seconds. Once they regrouped in the RV, Lena handed Ranger the rest of her sandwich as a reward. The dog took it without hesitation. Loyal heroes deserved late-night snacks. Tom ruffled Ranger's ears. Good boy. You just saved us from a vacation in county jail. The RV rattled away, leaving only tire tracks that fresh snow quickly erased. Back at the warehouse, Henry sat with his shoulders hunched over the computer as Lena input chemical data from the samples. She cross-referenced reports, agricultural records, and leaked laboratory analyses that Greenstone thought they had buried. We have enough to build a scientific case, she said. Ever yield kills the soil by design. She tapped her laptop angrily. They knew. They always knew. But numbers alone were not enough. People didn't respond to charts, they responded to pain. So Lena released a small but strategic leak, just 2 emails hinting at a cover-up posted anonymously to a popular farming forum. She leaned back with a satisfied smirk. Time to give this seed a little water. The reaction was immediate. Farmers across the state panicked. Greenstone phones rang non-stop. Men in suits scrambled to silence a spark that was spreading fast. At Greenstone's headquarters, hundreds of miles away, a tall, impeccably dressed man slammed a glass of whiskey onto his desk. Gregory Cole, with silver-streaked hair and eyes the color of winter steel, looked like the polished CEO his board admired. But beneath the crisp suit was a man who hated losing. And now someone was threatening everything he pretended to be. Find the leak, he snarled to his assistant, voice dripping venom, and crush it. Then he smirked coldly. Start with the weak link. 2 days later, flashing lights painted George Miller's farmhouse walls in red and blue. His loyal old cattle dog barked desperately as officers' faces hidden behind winter hats forced George into handcuffs. Sheriff Collins stood nearby, thick arms crossed smugly. The sheriff's mustache twitched as he called out charges too absurd to be coincidence: gun possession without permit. Disorderly conduct from years ago suddenly resurrected like a ghost. George shouted desperation, cracking his voice. This is Greenstone. They know you helped us. Collins ignored him and slammed the cruiser door shut. When Henry received the news, his knuckles whitened as he clenched the table. Anger flared hot beneath the ice in his heart. Tom immediately suggested ambushing the transport vehicle, quick, effective, and beautifully chaotic. But Henry shook his head. If we play their game, we give them the right to make us villains. He looked at Ranger, who sat poised like a wolf before a hunt. We fight them with truth, not bullets. Lena grinned. Good. Because hacking is a lot more fun than jail. She dove into old databases, dredging up security camera footage from a small feed store, showing George peacefully buying hay at the exact time he allegedly caused a disturbance in town. Then she infiltrated the police department system, uncovering an email exchange from Sheriff Collins. Find a reason to hold Miller. Orders from GC. Gregory Cole. Boom. Henry sent everything to Samuel Price, whose quiet voice hid a sharp legal mind. The next morning, Samuel strode into the courthouse, small frame wrapped in a tidy coat, tablet in hand. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He simply tapped a screen, each document, each timestamp, each lie, unraveling the charges thread by thread. Within minutes, George Miller was free. Snowfall dusted his hair as he exited the jail, stunned by the sudden daylight. Ranger ran forward and pressed against him, tail sweeping the snow in relief. George laughed, shaky but real, like the first breath after almost drowning. Lena's midnight whisper turned into a story splashed across local and Minneapolis news. The truth had taken its first step into the light. Henry watched the sunrise break through the clouds, turning the sky gold. For a moment, hope warmed him from within. But the war wasn't over. He knew Greenstone would strike harder next time. He placed a hand on Ranger's back. "They're scared," he whispered. "Good. Let's give them a reason to be terrified." Dawn came softly, its light a pale silver bleeding through low winter clouds, but the cold still clung to Fargo like a warning to stay indoors. Henry Walker stood at the edge of his father's land breath, painting frost into the air, and watched the line of approaching headlights snake across the snowy road. Ranger sat beside him, fur-frosted posture, alert ears flicking as each truck rumbled closer. What once had been a lonely battlefield for one old veteran and a half-wild dog was becoming a gathering of resolve. Pickup trucks of every age, new wheels with shining chrome beside rust-eaten veterans of decades, pulled into the yard one by one. Men and women climbed down, bundled in flannels, worn denim, and thick insulated jackets. Their faces, weather-carved and honest, now showed something Henry hadn't seen in a long time, courage outweighing fear. At the front stepped Frank Donovan, an old friend of Thomas Walker. Frank was in his late 60s, tall but stooped slightly, from years of lifting hay bales, with a clean-shaven jaw and slate-gray eyes, tired from the burden of swallowing injustice too long. His voice was deep and coarse as gravel as he spoke. "We've been hiding behind fear so long, it started to feel like home. But we're here now, Henry. You say the word, and we stand with you." Henry's throat tightened. He had once commanded soldiers in war, but commanding neighbors was a different weight. He felt responsibility, not rank. Lena Hayes stood nearby, wrapped in a thick parka far too big for her small frame. Her fingers fidgeted for a moment, as though itching for a keyboard instead of cold air, but her dark eyes held a fire of righteous anger. Tom Garcia leaned against his truck, arms folded, broad shoulders, steady jaw set like a wall. His military past showed in his stance he was ready. This time they wouldn't hide in shadows. They would take the fight into the daylight. The plan was simple, but bold. They wouldn't break in. They wouldn't sabotage. They would blockade Greenstone Agrotech's main processing plant peacefully but unmistakably. Dozens of tractors, plows, and trucks would form a wall across every entrance. Cameras would see it. The world would see it. Lena would unleash every file, every damning email, every lab report Thomas Walker died protecting. The nation would no longer be able to call it a conspiracy whispered by old farmers. It would be truth in headlines. Morning thickened. Snow floated softly like drifting ash. The farmers rolled out horns, honking once in unison, like the heartbeat of a reborn community. At the plant gates, security guards in heavy jackets and shiny badges stood dumbfounded. None of their training had prepared them for dozens of determined citizens, arms-linked signs raised high. Stop killing our land, ever yield equals ever death. Justice for Thomas Walker. Children sat on their father's shoulders, eyes wide with wonder, as if watching everyday life transform into something heroic. Henry stood on the bed of his pickup Ranger beside him, like a loyal sentinel. The old dog sniffed, offered sausage links and jerky from laughing farmers, tail wagging in a rare moment of joy amid defiance. The crowd erupted into warm chuckles, a brief shimmer of humor that made the cold feel less deadly. Cameras clicked. Drones buzzed overhead. Reporters shoved microphones toward Henry, and he found his voice steady, stronger than he expected. My father didn't die in an accident, he told the world. Greenstone murdered our land, and they murdered his silence. We won't be silent any longer. As his words echoed, Lena pressed a single key, and the truth exploded into America. News anchors blinked in shock as documents rolled across screens, emails revealing corporate orders to starve soil, financial trails paying off local enforcers, scientific proof. Everyield was a designed addiction. Faces across the country saw what had happened in Fargo, not a tragedy of negligence, but a crime committed with suits, pen strokes, and greed. Within hours, national agencies were knocking down Greenstone's doors. The FBI let out a furious Gregory Cole, his perfect hair now disheveled, his charm fallen away to reveal the venom beneath. His eyes raged at the cameras as though how dare the world expose him. His executives followed, hands cuffed behind expensive coats. Sheriff Collins' broad chest suddenly sinking was stripped of his badge, sputtering excuses. No one listened. The cameras had already judged him. Cheers rolled through the blockade. Men who rarely smiled laughed like children. Women hugged each other in disbelief and relief. George Miller, free and vindicated, cried openly as he embraced Henry, his hands trembling not with fear but gratitude. The wolves had been cornered. The hunt was over. Months passed with legal battles and deep winter thawing slowly into spring. Teams of environmental specialists arrived to begin restoring the damaged soil. Lawsuits piled atop Greenstone's ruins, handled by Samuel Price, with newfound allies, lawyers, who once ignored small voices now eager to champion a resurrection story. Henry watched tractor after tractor seed hope into the earth again. One evening, when the ground was still cold but promised future green, Henry stood on the cleared foundation of his father's burned home. The snow had melted away, revealing dark soil ready for healing. Ranger pressed his head against Henry's knee, eyes, gentle, older now, but glowing with victory. Henry whispered to the wind, "We did it, Dad." But he knew that meant something more. His war wasn't over. Just this battle. There were other towns, other lands, other families crushed by the weight of greed. He was 70 bones aching, breath shallow on cold mornings, but justice had given him purpose again. With quiet resolve, he packed a duffel bag, loaded supplies into his truck boots, maps, a battered rifle he hoped he'd never need. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat without hesitation, as if the dog knew this road before Henry did. The engine rumbled to life. Snowflakes drifted once more, soft reminders of how small humans were against the seasons. But Henry had learned that courage didn't need youth, it only needed loyalty and truth. As the truck rolled slowly toward the horizon, neighbors waved from driveways, stories already forming into legends. Children would tell them for years. There was an old veteran and his dog. They didn't fight with guns. They fought with truth. Out on lonely winter nights, when wind howled through the North Dakota plains, some swore they saw the faint glow of headlights gliding across drifts and the silhouette of a German shepherd riding shotgun. A silent promise that hope once awakened does not die. In the quiet after the storm, when Henry and Ranger drove into the fading winter light, their journey whispered a truth older than the land itself. Sometimes miracles don't arrive as flashes of lightning. Sometimes they come as courage, as loyalty, as the quiet strength to stand up for what is right. And whether you call it fate, divine guidance, or the gentle hand of God, there are moments in life when light breaks through the coldest winters and reminds us we are never fighting alone. Maybe your miracle is small. Maybe it's hidden. Maybe it's waiting for you the way Ranger waited for Henry, patient, loyal, faithful. But it is there, and in our everyday lives, in the long nights, the heavy burdens, the battles we never asked for, God still works through ordinary people and unexpected companions, through an old veteran, through a loyal dog, through someone like you. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it so it can bring hope to someone who needs it today. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments and share a moment when you felt a little miracle in your own life. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel so you never miss another story of faith, courage, and the small wonders God places in our paths. May the Lord bless you, protect your home, guide your steps, and let His light warm every cold corner of your life. God bless you, and thank you for being here.